The morning sun spilled through the soaring glass windows of San Francisco International Airport, painting the gleaming concourse in warm gold. 4-year-old Liam Patel grasped his guardian's hand with shining excitement, his little legs practically dancing as he spotted the luxurious SkyVista charter waiting at gate B12. To him, it wasn't just another flight. It was a grand adventure. Today, he was traveling first class, a place he'd only ever glimpsed in his father's stories and in the photos displayed in the SkyVista lounge. His chest swelled with pride, and his imagination raced with the possibilities of reclining leather seats, fluffy pillows, and perhaps even a treat from the in-flight dessert cart. Beside him, his guardian, Ms. Rodriguez, a kindly woman in her early 50s hired by his father, smiled indulgently. She knelt to meet his eager blue eyes. "Ready to show off your artwork to Daddy?" she asked, smoothing the edges of the precious drawing clutched in his free hand. It was a colorful sketch of a towering airplane soaring over puffy clouds, with "Happy Travels, Daddy" scribbled underneath. Liam nodded solemnly, as though his life's mission depended on that picture. Arjun Patel was not on this morning's flight. As the innovative CEO of SkyVista Airlines, he was tied up in board meetings at company headquarters. But everyone in Liam's world knew this flight was special. It was taking the little boy to St. Lucia, where Arjun would be honored that evening with the CEO of the Year award. Liam's guardian would deliver the drawing and, if he was lucky, give his father a hug on his behalf. It was a mission with weight far heavier than the back and forth of ordinary travel. They descended the jet bridge and stepped into the hushed sanctuary of the A350's first-class cabin. The sky blue carpeting and polished wood paneling felt like walking into a palace built among the clouds. As soon as the door slid closed behind them, a flight attendant in crisp navy pressed her lips into a tight line. She offered a polite nod, but no greeting. Something in her cool gaze made Liam pause. He glanced up at Ms. Rodriguez, whose eyebrows lifted ever so slightly, but Ms. Rodriguez only gave him a reassuring squeeze. Liam toddled forward, eyes wide as he spotted his suite. A wide, cream leather seat with a fold-out ottoman, a plush blue blanket tucked neatly across the back, and a pillow monogrammed with the SkyVista logo. He imagined leaning back, pressing play on the personal entertainment screen, maybe watching cartoons at 30,000 feet. He hustled to set his drawing on the small side table, ready for the moment his father's eyes would fall on it. Moments later, the flight attendant cleared her throat. "I'm sorry, but passengers under 6 are not permitted in this cabin," she said in a voice devoid of warmth. "You'll need to take your son to the business class section, please." Liam's smile vanished. "But this is where Daddy wants me to wait for him," he said, voice trembling. He pointed to the drawing, imagining his father's proud grin. Ms. Rodriguez stepped between them. "He's under special care, ma'am," she said quietly. "He has a medical condition that requires monitoring in a quieter environment." The attendant's lips curved with thin skepticism. "I'm afraid those are company guidelines. There are safety regulations, strict age limits." She waved toward the business class staircase. "Please, this way." Liam's little hand clenched the paper as if he could protect it from the world. He shook his head. Tears welled in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. His own apology, as though he had done something wrong. The indignity of being sent away from the one place he thought he belonged ripped at his heart. Ms. Rodriguez bent to scoop him up. "It's okay, buddy. I'll find you a comfy seat. Daddy will be so happy to see your drawing." But the warmth in her tone couldn't fill the void in his chest. As she turned away, Liam cast one last longing look at the empty suite. From the corner of his eye, he saw the attendant's hand flick dismissively toward his drawing. It fluttered to the floor between them. Liam knelt, his legs wobbling, pulled in the heavy blanket across his shoulders, and crawled forward to retrieve it. As his fingers grazed the edge, she flicked it again, sending the paper skidding toward the ottoman. He reached for it a second time, tears now trickling down his cheeks. "Please," he breathed, small and broken. "It's for Daddy." That's when the attendant's face shifted. a flicker of annoyance hardened into something darker. She stepped forward, snatched the drawing away, and, before anyone could intervene, ripped it down the middle with a swift, sharp tear. The paper tore, the colors splintered, and Liam yelped as though he'd been struck. Horror froze the cabin. Liam's mouth fell open, the torn halves drifting to the carpet. He stared at her with wide, heartbroken eyes. "Why?" he choked out. Then a single, small sob escaped. The attendant didn't reply. Her arms crossed as though she'd served justice. Around them, other passengers averted their eyes or looked away. None dared to step in. Liam huddled in Ms. Rodriguez's arms, pressing the jagged edges of his artwork to his chest, his tears falling onto the torn drawing like rain. In that unbearable moment, Arjun Patel's ethos, that no barrier should stand between a child and his innocence, was violated in the most public, cruel way. The first-class cabin, once a palace in the sky, had become a stage for a profound injustice, and in the midst of polished wood and buttery leather, a small boy realized the world could be terribly unfair. As Liam's tears subsided into quiet hiccups, Ms. Rodriguez lowered him onto the business class seat across the aisle, a seat just fine for most travelers, but woefully inadequate for this little passenger whose heart had been wounded. Liam pressed the torn drawing against his cheek, closing his eyes to the bright cabin lights as he tried to make sense of the unkindness. In his mind, there was only one thought: "Daddy, I need you." And miles above the Pacific, the engine's soft drone underscored the silent promise forming in Liam's gentle heartbeat. Sometimes, good people would have to fight harder to make things right. The cabin lights glowed softly as the SkyVista Airbus A350 lifted off, its engines humming a steady lullaby. 4-year-old Liam Patel sat in business class now, clutching the two torn halves of his drawing to his chest. He'd barely had time to process the cruelty of the torn paper before the door slid shut, and the plane rolled onto the runway. Somewhere up ahead, hidden behind a curtain, first class waited, empty now, but for the empty suit that had been his. Sandra Whitmore, the first-class attendant, had retreated beyond that curtain, arms folded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Liam didn't see her anymore, but he felt her presence like a cold draft under the door. Ms. Rodriguez guided him to a wide leather seat and tucked him in, smoothing the blanket around his small shoulders. "We'll be safe here, sweet pea," she whispered, brushing away his tears with gentle fingertips. But her eyes flicked toward the curtain, filled with a worry Liam couldn't translate. Liam pressed his cheek against the plush headrest, his heart thumping so loudly he could almost hear it over the engines. He remembered Ms. Rodriguez's soft voice. "He's under special care, ma'am," she'd said, and he'd tried to nod so the attendant would leave him alone. But she hadn't. Instead, she'd destroyed his picture, the only gift he had for his father. He drew his knees close, still holding those bright scraps of paper, trying to calm the whirlwind in his chest. Behind the curtain, the flight attendant's voice drifted out, razor sharp and controlled. "I've escorted all children under 6 to business class today," she said to some unseen colleague. "Don't question me." It was an order, not a request. There was no room for debate. Liam curled tighter in his seat, wishing he could disappear beneath the blanket. The flight attendants in business class offered polite smiles, but no warmth. One hovered with a tray of juice boxes, her eyebrows raised in polite pity when she saw his red-rimmed eyes. "Would you like some apple juice?" she asked in a soft, sympathetic tone. Liam's throat closed up. Juice sounded nice, but he barely heard the words. He shook his head and pressed the drawing fragments against his heart. Ms. Rodriguez cleared her throat. "Let's just get you comfortable," she said. Her voice was steady. She always knew what to do, but Liam felt anything but comforted. He looked up at her, his eyes brimming. "But I wanted Daddy to see it." The lump in his throat made the words catch. He swallowed hard. "He'll be sad." Ms. Rodriguez reached into her bag and pulled out a fresh sketchbook. "How about you draw him another picture?" she suggested. I'll make sure it stays safe." She flipped open the blank pages, offering him a new canvas. Liam stared down at the crisp white sheet, imagining Sandra's scissors ripping it in half. He set it aside. "No," he whispered. "I don't want to draw. Not right now." His shoulders slumped, and the light from the window glinted off his tears. The cabin's gentle sway seemed to echo his sorrow. Liam pressed a finger to his wrist, feeling the faint hum of the little green bracelet his dad had given him. He remembered his father's voice, calm and reassuring. "That bracelet will always keep you safe, son." He let his finger trace the smooth band, trying to channel that same calm. But even the bracelet felt powerless against the ache in his chest. Minutes passed in silence, each second stretching longer than the one before. Business class passengers leaned forward in their seats, buried in books or screens, aware of the small boy whose eyes brimmed with silent tears. A woman across the aisle shifted, her face softening with sympathy. She reached out to pat his knee. "Hang in there, kiddo," she murmured. Liam mustered a tiny nod. He wanted to tell her he wished she could stop time, stop the pain. But the words got stuck. Ms. Rodriguez, seated beside him, opened the window shade a crack. The Pacific Ocean shimmered in the morning sun, waves glinting like scattered diamonds. She pointed to the view. "Look, Liam, aren't those pretty?" He turned, wiping his eyes. The ocean did look beautiful, vast and untroubled. He pressed his hand against the glass, imagining the endless sea as a place where nothing could hurt him. For a moment, the turbulence of his feelings stilled. But then a voice boomed quietly from behind the curtain. His father's voice, calm yet authoritative. The cabin lights flickered, and every personal screen in business class switched to a live message. "Hello, this is Arjun Patel, CEO of SkyVista Airlines. We apologize for the events that occurred in first class. This flight will be grounded upon arrival for an immediate investigation. Thank you for your patience as we ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers, especially our littlest ones." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Liam's heart leapt. His eyes widened, and he looked at Ms. Rodriguez, whose hand trembled ever so slightly as she reached for his. The voice continued. "And to the gentleman or lady responsible for this, we will be in touch. Justice will be served." Liam felt a flush of warmth spread through him, pride mixed with relief. His father had seen what happened. He hadn't forgotten him after all. He looked at the torn drawing fragments still pressed against his chest and imagined them whole again. Perhaps his father would help him fix it. Ms. Rodriguez scooped Liam into her arms, cradling him as the other passengers murmured in approval. The hostess from business class hurried over, offering a gentle smile. "Let's get you some warm cookies, buddy, courtesy of Mr. Patel." She pressed a small plate of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies into his hands. Liam sniffed the sweet aroma and managed a small smile, taking a careful bite. As the plane cruised toward its destination, Liam nestled into Ms. Rodriguez's side, crumbs dotting his shirt. He pressed the drawing against his heart once more and let the warmth of the cabin and his father's voice soothe him. For the first time since boarding, he believed that sometimes, even when the world felt unfair, there was someone who would stand up and make it right. And so, in that quiet moment, Liam learned a lesson no broken drawing could teach. Courage wasn't always loud. Sometimes it arrived on a whisper across a cabin, a gentle baked cookie, or a father's voice echoing through the sky. Sandra Whitmore stood just beyond the glittering curtain that marked the boundary between first class and business class, arms crossed over her navy blazer. She was the picture of composure, immaculately coiffed hair, pearl earrings catching the cabin light, heels clicking on the carpet as she patrolled her domain. To her, this was a stage, and every passenger was an actor there to perform proper deference. Children like Liam were the worst kind of distraction, untidy and unpredictable. From her vantage point, she surveyed the remaining first-class suites. Plush leather seats in jet cream and pale azure curved around tiny tables set with crystal water goblets and monogrammed linens. Each suite was its own private salon in the sky, designed for sophistication and tranquility. She couldn't abide any hint of chaos. For Sandra, the airline attendant's manual wasn't just guidelines. It was gospel. There was no room for compromise. A soft chime sounded on her belt. The in-ear comm from the galley. With a crisp nod, Sandra stepped into the cabin proper and addressed a couple reclining in seats 1A and 1B. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. Your caviar service will depart momentarily. Please allow me a moment to stow your menus." Her voice was honeyed, warm. Everything a first-class attendant should project when the right people were watching. But the moment her back was turned, she flicked her eyes toward the curtain. Behind that thin barrier lay business class, where the lone child sat clutching torn drawings and, worse yet, wearing a bracelet that could disrupt the careful ecosystem Sandra maintained. In her mind, children were a different species. They belonged in family class, or better yet, daycare programs on the ground. They did not belong here, sipping champagne spritzers between gourmet appetizers. She stepped through the aisle, greeting other passengers with practiced fluency. Yet her gaze flicked back to Liam as though she might banish him with sheer will. She paused by the minibar, adjusting a row of crystal flutes until they formed a perfect terrace. When a soft bang echoed from the galley, a tray dropped, perhaps. Sandra's shoulders tensed. Disorder, no matter how small, was intolerable. Minutes earlier, she had watched him being escorted to business class, Miss Rodriguez hovering over his tiny frame. She'd overheard the child's whispered apology. "I'm sorry." Those two words echoed in her mind now, like a drumbeat of irritation. Why should the world bend for someone who was not even old enough to understand? She retrieved a service tablet from her apron pocket and scrolled through the flight manifest, finding Liam's name flagged under VIP Child Exception. Her lips curled. If anyone had the right to sit here, it was her. After all, she'd graduated top of her class in service training. Yet here was a 4-year-old ticketed for first class by virtue of his surname, not his own accomplishments. Sandra's training emphasized discretion, but discretion didn't mean tolerance. The baby grand of in-flight protocol meant that every gesture mattered. A nod here, a raised eyebrow there. So she crossed her arms again and leaned against the polished wood bulkhead, waiting for the cabin to settle. She watched the business class passengers fill in the charts on their screens, the hum of quiet conversations drifting through the vents. They had no idea she was watching them, not as individuals, but as potential threats to her meticulously curated environment. She replayed the morning's events in her mind. The child toddled into first class like he owned it, shrieking with excitement to be inside the velvet ropes. The look on his face was the same expression indulgent parents gave their toddlers in department stores. It felt disrespectful. When Ms. Rodriguez had planted him in business class, she'd made Sandra look petty in front of her colleagues. Any display of weakness would ripple through the crew like a contagious chill. She could not allow that. A soft ding punctuated the air again. The same in-ear comm. "Flight 4626 has reached cruising altitude," the pilot's voice crackled. "Service will begin in 5. At the announcement, several passengers raised their eyes expectantly. This was Sandra's moment to shine. Truffles, smoked salmon, the full works, all presented with a flourish that could soften the hardest of hearts. She straightened her shoulders, brushed imaginary lint from her sleeve, and stepped forward. In a voice measured like a metronome, she called, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to first-class service. May I offer you a glass of SkyVista Brut, or perhaps a specially curated cappuccino?" A ripple of appreciative smiles followed. The cabin had fallen under her spell once more, but the thrill of affirmation was always tinged with a dark undercurrent. The unspoken hierarchy, adult over child, pedigree over poverty, bonded her with like-minded passengers. She caught a businessman eyeing her from across the aisle, and she nodded imperceptibly. He returned the nod, gratitude shining in his gaze. Together, They were keepers of a privilege that life's lottery had granted them. As long as they stuck to the unwritten rules, the world would remain orderly. She watched as Steinberg family placed their trays for lunch. Lobster bisque in hand-blown bowls, artisan bread brushed with garlic butter. The faint pop of a champagne cork punctuated the scene, and the cabin door slid open, admitting a rush of sunlight. Sandra allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. This was her domain, and she would defend it with every ounce of protocol she could muster. Back in business class, Liam snuck a peek toward the first-class curtain. He hugged his drawing fragments close, his heart fluttering with hope that perhaps his father's voice would return. But all he saw was Sandra's heels disappearing behind a tray of hors d'oeuvres. He pressed a hand to his chest, as though feeling for the steady thrum of his bracelet. A promise of safety, but also a reminder that he didn't belong here. Sandra paused at the curtain's edge, adjusted her cap, then turned to float toward the exit door. She'd done her duty, protected first class from the chaos of childhood. When the flight ended, she'd get her bonus for spotlessly clean service records. But she made a mental note to flag that VIP parent exception on her tablet. Names like Patel would have to be escalated, questioned, verified. There could be no more special cases, no more drawing-toting children. As she stepped into the galley, she ran a hand along the stainless steel countertop, feeling the cold efficiency beneath her fingertips. The world might be cruel, she thought, but that was life. The skies were hers to manage, and she would never let it slip into disorder on her watch. Unseen by Sandra, behind the curtain, a little boy's eyes filled with tears, but not of fear. Somewhere deep in his heart, a flicker of resolve ignited, that nothing, not even the ice queen of first class, could take away his faith in kindness. And high above the Pacific, the plane carved a path through cloud and sky, carrying scores of souls. Some blind to cruelty, others prepared to stand against it. In the silent space between gusts of wind, the real battle for justice had begun. A hush settled over business class as the cabin lights dimmed to their soft, ambient glow. 4-year-old Liam Patel sat hugging his torn drawing, knees tucked under his chin, watching the curtain at the front of the cabin. He didn't know where his guardian was, or why the big people had such strained faces, but he knew one thing: he felt utterly small. Sandra Whitmore emerged from first class, crisp uniform flawless, heels clicking with silent authority. She carried herself like a queen entering her court. But today, her court was a battlefield, and at its center stood a lone child. Him. "Excuse me, young man," she said, voice low and rehearsed. Liam flinched, eyes wide. He looked up at the attendant's polished black shoes, then at the cold, unreadable expression on her face. Sandra reached out and yanked the small backpack from the seat beside him, sending a toy airplane spilling onto the carpet. "What's this? You think you're some kind of VIP? Pointless trinkets for a child?" With a swift motion, she kicked the toy aside. It skittered under a nearby ottoman. Liam's bottom lip quivered. It's my plane," he whispered. "I drew it for Daddy." Sandra's lips curled in a half-smirk. "Your drawing? Pathetic." She grabbed the torn fragments from his lap and waved them mockingly before the other passengers. "Look at this, ripped up like yesterday's newspaper. You kids and your scribbles." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but none spoke. One elderly gentleman turned to his wife and shrugged. Another yawned, burying his politeness under a designer scarf. Business class had no shortage of rules about civility, but none about standing up for a 4-year-old. Liam's small voice trembled. Please give it back." He reached out with one shaky hand, fingertips brushing the corner of the paper. Instead, Sandra grasped the torn paper and, with a single, vicious tug, ripped it straight down the middle, scattering colorful confetti across the floor. "Let's see you fix that, Picasso," she sneered. "Or is that too much to ask?" Tears welled in Liam's eyes, but he blinked them back. The hush in the cabin deepened. The only sound was the engine's steady thrum. He stared at the torn picture, the red and blue crayons bleeding through the rips, and something broke inside him. Sandra sighed theatrically and crossed her arms. Honestly, I don't know why he's even here. Children under 6 are a nuisance, period. If Mr. Patel wants to pay our fares, he can send us more staff, but not bratty toddlers. Liam's guardian, Ms. Rodriguez, hurried forward, cheeks flushed. Ms. Whitmore, please, she began, soft but urgent. Sandra cut her off with a sharp glance. Save it. I follow company policy. No exceptions. She turned back to Liam. Now sit still. She leaned down, cuffing him on the shoulder so hard his body jerked. You hear me? Sit still or I'll have you escorted off at the next stop. A gasp rippled through the cabin. A young executive in the row ahead closed his laptop and leaned forward, eyes flicking from Sandra to the quivering child. But then he leaned back, as if remembering some unwritten rule. Don't get involved. Liam bit his lip so hard he tasted blood. His fingers curled into the seat fabric. He fought back a scream. The world felt cold, and the lights above seemed too bright. Sandra straightened and surveyed her handiwork with detached approval. Good. That's better. She glanced around as though expecting applause. When none came, she shrugged and moved on down the aisle, heels clicking again. In the silence that followed, business class passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Some averted their eyes. Others stared at the curtain separating them from the quiet luxury of first class. Liam sat frozen, tears streaming down his cheeks at last, tiny shoulders shaking. He felt a soft hand on his back, Ms. Rodriguez placing a gentle arm around him. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, she whispered. I'll get you a fresh sheet of paper, I promise. Liam shook his head, muffling his sob against her sleeve. She said Daddy wouldn't care, that I ruined everything. No, Ms. Rodriguez murmured, stroking his hair. Your daddy cares. He cares so much. She drew him closer, shielding him from cold gazes. A flight attendant in the galley poked her head out. Is everything okay here? She asked. Her voice was professional, but tinged with concern. Miss Rodriguez straightened, gathering herself. We're fine now, thank you. She looked at the attendant, her eyes flashing with a quiet plea. Help me hold this together. The attendant nodded and slipped back, closing the galley door. Liam pressed his cheek against the fabric of the seat, wiped his wet face on his sleeve, and looked up at the small emergency card clipped to the seat back. The schematic of life vests and oxygen masks felt miles away from his reality. He was 4 years old. The cabin was a polished arena of grown-ups, each bound by an unspoken contract of polite behavior. Yet here he was, alone in his pain. After a moment, he turned to Ms. Rodriguez. Can we go home now? He asked, voice small and hollow. She swallowed hard, blinking back tears of her own. Not yet. She offered him a juice box, the one with the penguin on it. Here, maybe a sip will help. Liam took it, hands still trembling. He twisted the cap but didn't drink. Instead, he stared down at the juice, as if it might hold the answers. Behind the curtain in first class, Sandra paused. She straightened her posture, smoothed her skirt, and offered a crisp, professional smile to the next passenger in line. She was the guardian of order. She had protected her domain, and in her mind, she had done nothing wrong. Back in business class, Liam lifted the torn paper and traced the ripped edges with a fingertip, imagining the full picture of his airplane soaring free. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Somewhere far above the clouds, his father was watching. Somewhere, justice was gathering strength. And as the plane sliced through the sky toward its destination, a silent promise took root in his heart. One day, he would see the broken pieces made whole again. The cabin lights remained dimmed in business class, but the glare of polite indifference was brighter than any spotlight. 4-year-old Liam Patel sat curled into his seat, still clutching the jagged edges of his torn sketch. Around him, fellow passengers went about their lives as though nothing had happened, heads bent over devices, muted conversations like distant murmurs, eyes steely with self-interest. An elderly couple 2 rows ahead leaned toward one another, whispering behind well-manicured hands. The woman, draped in pearls, tut-tutted before casting her gaze back to the first-class curtain. "Children these days," she murmured, "so entitled." Her husband nodded sagely, adjusting his designer glasses. Neither offered so much as a glance in Liam's direction, as if his small frame and heartbreak were invisible. A few seats down, a man in a crisp gray suit scrolled through market charts on a tablet. He glanced up at Liam's sobs, then back at his screen without missing a beat. Moments later, he replayed the humiliation in his mind and tapped a quick note into his phone. "Add unaccompanied minors clause to our next policy update." His thumbs moved so fast it was as if he were carving that moment into corporate law. Closer still, a mother in a cashmere shawl offered her child a cookie, whispering, "Be quiet, sweetheart. There's nothing to see." She swept a tissue across her own lips, murmuring about people who shouldn't pay for first class. Her daughter nodded obediently, eyes wide, then turned back to her tablet, as though the sight of a scared boy was merely a footnote in their journey. Only the flight attendant who'd brought Liam juice earlier seemed aware of the injustice. She paused at the galley doorway, eyes lingering on his trembling shoulders. But she was bound by duty. She straightened her apron, slipped back behind the curtain, and let the staccato footfalls of Sandra's heels take her place. No one spoke up. No one intervened. Ms. Rodriguez, seated at Liam's side, felt each act of indifference like a pinch at her ribs. She caught glances from passengers who saw her as nothing more than a nuisance, a chaperone for a brat in the wrong cabin. When she dared to clear her throat and ask if anyone had a scrap of tape for the torn drawing, most shook their heads or mumbled apologies. A young banker leaned over and offered a single mint, as though that small gesture could erase the harm. Liam took it politely, but didn't eat, his eyes luminous with betrayal. "Why won't they help me?" Liam whispered, voice raw. He folded the mint wrapper into a tiny square and placed it atop the torn paper, as though by some magic that might hold the pieces together. "Daddy said people do the right thing." His lip quivered, and a fresh tear traced a path down his cheek. Ms. Rodriguez wrapped her cardigan tighter around him. "They're just busy," she whispered, voice trembling with anger she refused to show. "Sometimes people forget what it's like to be small." She glanced at the curtained entrance to first class, wondering if Sandra would ever face a crowd that turned away from cruelty instead of toward it. Behind the curtain, muffled laughter floated into business class, Sandra's triumphant chuckle as she polled her colleagues for praise. In that instant, a shock of resolve pulsed through Liam's chest. He straightened on his seat, tugged at Ms. Rodriguez's sleeve, and met her gaze with wide sincerity. "Will Daddy make it stop?" he asked, clutching the torn drawing fragments and the mint wrapper like they were talismans. Ms. Rodriguez swallowed hard. She brushed Liam's hair from his forehead and gave a small, sad smile. "He will," she promised. "I know he will." Outside the window, the plane cut through a blanket of clouds, the sky a perfect blue canvas. Inside, a different atmosphere reigned, one of silent complicity and fractured empathy. Liam pressed his hand to the glass, imagining a world vast enough to hold kindness for everyone, even a small boy tucked into business class. And though no one else offered comfort, Liam felt a flicker of warmth from the promise in Ms. Rodriguez's voice. It was the spark that keeps hope alive when the world seems to have forgotten how to care. As the flight pressed on toward St. Lucia, Liam resolved that one day he would stand up for those with no one else to speak for them. But for now, he leaned into the soft rhythm of the cabin, bracing himself against the echoes of indifference and waiting for justice to take its silent flight. Liam's small body felt heavier than ever as he leaned into Ms. Rodriguez's side. Her cardigan smelled faintly of lavender and cinnamon, a scent he'd never forget. Yet it offered only a fragile shield against the ache in his chest. He pressed the torn fragments of his drawing to his heart and closed his eyes, trying to will the world back into something that made sense. He remembered the way his father always tucked him in at night, brushing his hair and whispering, "You're safe, little man. I've got you." Those words had been a promise, one that felt both comforting and distant now. How could Daddy keep his promise when the skies themselves seemed determined to hurt him? Across the miles, in a glass-walled corner office overlooking downtown Palo Alto, Arjun Patel stared at his laptop in stunned silence. A soft red icon blinked in the corner of the screen, an emergency alert from the prototype smart bracelet he'd installed on Liam during last year's company retreat. It wasn't supposed to be used for anything but medical monitoring, certainly not for confronting in-flight cruelty, and yet here it was, sending him live snippets of a moment he'd never imagined. His son, his only child, being humiliated in business class. He blinked back the wild surge of anger. Memories flooded his mind. Late nights drafting business plans in his parents' garage. The first small chartering contract that meant the world to his fledgling airline. The crushing fear each time he pitched investors who saw a young Indian American from Silicon Valley as a risk. Every victory had taken grit and the quiet conviction that fairness and dignity were not luxuries, but necessities. Now his own corporate code of conduct was being weaponized against the most innocent passenger on any plane. His lips pressed into a thin line. He thought of Liam's brave little face, shoulders drawn in, eyes bright despite the tears. The boy had held on to hope to his last breath of courage. Arjun closed his eyes and listened to the faint hum of the city below, a far cry from the rolling engines of the A350. But it reminded him of something fundamental. His life's work was built on the belief that right must triumph over might. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, palms flat against the cool glass. The bay shimmered in the afternoon sun, indifferent to the turmoil in his chest. He replayed the video feed again, the way Liam's finger trembled as it brushed the torn paper, the tiny gasp that escaped his lips, the silent plea in his gaze. He'd taught that boy to stand tall, to help others, to fight injustice. Instead of this, his breath came in slow, measured pulls. This would have to be the moment he lived those lessons. He tapped the emergency override on his keyboard, a command only accessible to the CEO. It wouldn't scream across the cabin. No, it would whisper through their in-flight entertainment system, triggering the clear deck protocol he'd quietly embedded for any real crisis. Then he would board the next flight himself and face Sandra Whitmore like a man bearing the weight of his responsibilities. Arjun hovered his finger over the final confirmation. He thought of Liam's soft voice, of the brave chin he tried so hard to keep raised, of the shattered drawing still clutched in his tiny hand. And he remembered his own father's words from 50 years ago. "Son, the world will knock you flat if you let it, but the measure of a man is how he picks himself up and how he protects those who cannot protect themselves." With that, he pressed enter. The line of code vanished from the screen, replaced by a muted green check mark. In that instant, somewhere high above the Pacific, each seatback monitor in first class and business class would switch to his announcement. Justice wouldn't arrive with fanfare. It wouldn't roar. It would settle in quietly, like a last chord that brings an entire symphony to stillness. Back on the plane, Liam stirred at the soft glow spilling from the overhead lights, his thumb tracing the outline of the rips in his drawing. Ms. Rodriguez had drifted into a light doze, her head leaning against the window. He opened his eyes and felt something shift, a calm that hadn't been there before. Down the aisle, the curtain that separated him from first class quivered, as though caught in a breathless moment. Liam didn't yet know what was happening. He only sensed that whatever was about to come would be bigger than a torn piece of paper, bigger than any painful words or ruthless rule. He pressed his small hand against his chest, right over his green bracelet. It was supposed to keep him safe, but what made him feel safest at that moment was the knowledge that his father was watching, that his father would not let cruelty go unchallenged. And so, in the hush between breaths, Liam found a spark of quiet resolve of his own. A seed of courage that would bloom the moment the cabin lights dimmed again and his father's voice echoed through the skies. Because sometimes, real strength is born not from a shout, but from a silent promise kept in the heart. The cabin's low hum settled into a tense calm as business-class passengers sifted through their tablets and seatback menus. 4-year-old Liam Patel sat tucked into a window seat, his palm resting lightly on the smooth plastic of his green bracelet. He didn't know why the air felt so electric, but his heartbeat picked up as a faint glow pulsed beneath his wrist. For months, his father had tinkered with that bracelet, calling it a safety prototype. But Liam thought of it as a toy, something that blinked when he laughed or fell asleep. Now, those gentle blinks turned urgent red, as if the device had just detected something it shouldn't. A tiny buzz echoed at Liam's fingertip, and without warning, the bracelet emitted a single, high-pitched ping. It was so quiet, no adult could have heard it, except for the plane's sophisticated IFE network, listening for just that signal. One by one, every personal screen flickered. Passengers glanced up, startled as the latest movie trailers and flight progress bars vanished. Even the screens in first class, hidden behind the velvet curtain, went dark. For a heartbeat, the entire aircraft sat in perfect silence, save for the gentle whine of the engines. Then, in crisp Helvetica, white letters appeared across every monitor. SkyVista Airlines, Incident Alert. The message held for 3 slow seconds before the cabin lights dimmed further, as though cued by a conductor's baton. A soft click penetrated the hush. Then Arjun Patel's voice, calm but resolute, filled every speaker. Good afternoon. This is Arjun Patel, CEO of SkyVista Airlines. We apologize for the insensitive treatment that occurred on this flight. A 4-year-old passenger was subjected to physical and emotional harm. Effective immediately, this flight is being grounded upon arrival for a full investigation. Thank you for your patience as we uphold our commitment to safety and respect for every individual, especially our littlest travelers. Sandra Whitmore froze mid-step in the galley doorway, service tray perched awkwardly in her hands. Her perfectly polished nails went white against the metal tray's edge. She blinked at the monitor above the curtain, then at the business class cabin, as if searching for someone else to take responsibility. Heat crept up her neck and across her cheeks. She tasted copper on her tongue. Behind her calm posture, her heart thudded so loud she feared it might crack her ribs. She stepped forward, but her legs trembled like they cared more about keeping her in place than moving her toward damage control. Passengers peeked around their seats, mouths agape. A few business executives in wingback chairs exchanged incredulous glances, then straightened their ties and sat up, as if the gravity of the message demanded a show of attention. Liam's eyes widened, reflecting the glow of the screen. He pressed his finger to the bracelet, feeling its warmth. For the first time since boarding, he felt powerful, safe. The torn drawing fragments rested on his lap, forgotten for the moment. He looked at Ms. Rodriguez, who sat beside him, her fingers tightening around his. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she managed a small, proud smile. "Your daddy's voice," she whispered. Her voice shook, but only enough for Liam to hear. "He's here for you." He nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. The hint of a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth, a spark of relief shining through the residue of his earlier fear. Arjun's message continued, each word measured, never raising its tone in anger. "To the crew member responsible, we will be in touch. Rest assured, actions will be taken to address this breach of our standards. Our passengers deserve dignity and care, and SkyVista will make this right." Sandra's tray clattered to the floor as she dropped it, glass jars and napkins skittering under the aisle. The sharp noise cracked the silence, drawing all eyes. A flight attendant from the back rushed forward, but Sandra waved her off, her face as pale as the cabin's overhead lights. She couldn't speak. Every protocol she once wielded now felt like a shackle around her throat. In the hush that followed, the cabin door slid open to admit a flood of sunlight. For a moment, the entire plane felt suspended between sky and reality, where power whispered instead of roared. Passengers rose slowly, gathering their belongings with purposeful calm. Some laid gentle hands on Liam's shoulder pads, murmuring encouragement. A mother in the front row placed a fresh sketch pad and box of crayons in his lap, an apology inked in kind gestures. Sandra stood rooted to the spot, staring at the monitors as if they had betrayed her. She'd built her career on polished routines and meticulous standards, but in that instant, she was caught naked, her cruelty broadcast to the whole cabin. Liam closed his eyes, letting the president-like gravitas of his father's voice wash over him. It was a promise ticking through his veins, an unspoken vow that no adult cruelty could stand unchallenged. He slid the sketchpad open to a blank page and gently laid his leftover crayon on top, feeling the weight of new possibilities. In a cabin that had once felt cold and indifferent, warmth blossomed. Passengers whispered words of support. The overhead bins opened to release fresh blankets and warm drinks. Even the flight attendants moved with a human softness, as though the CEO's quiet command had realigned every heart on board. And high above the Pacific, in the hush of the stratosphere, justice had arrived. Not with a shout, but with a single ping from a child's bracelet, and a father's steadfast voice speaking for the voiceless. For Liam Patel, the twist was not just in the words on the screen, but in the knowledge that sometimes the smallest among us hold the greatest power, and that a promise kept in silence can resonate louder than any storm. The cabin remained suspended in a stunned hush long after Arjun Patel's voice fell silent. Passengers sat motionless, heads turned toward their seatback screens as if afraid to blink. Business class chairs and first class suites alike held their occupants in a silent tableau. Silverware paused midway to lips, champagne glasses hovering under half-lifted brows. Even the gentle whoosh of air vents seemed unbearably loud in the stillness. It was as though time itself had tilted, and every soul on board felt its gravity. Eyes darted between screens and one another, searching for context. A corporate attorney in seat 3C suddenly snapped his briefcase shut, eyes wide enough to readjust his entire worldview. A retiree in pearls blinked until her vision cleared, then reached for her husband's hand, squeezing it with a tremble. A young executive muttered, "Did that just happen?" Under her breath, the words almost lost in the hush. Whispers began, soft, incredulous, spreading like ripples in a still pond. At the curtain's edge, the flight attendants gathered, their professional composure cracking for the first time. One leaned against the bulkhead, jaw slack, as she scrolled through her tablet to verify the alert. Another frowned, brows knitting in confusion, tapping at the in-ear comm. Their usual choreographed grace had dissolved. For a beat, they were strangers stranded in a moment they hadn't rehearsed. Across the aisle, Ms. Rodriguez cradled Liam in her lap, his eyes bright and unafraid. He pressed the torn drawing fragments against her cardigan, his small body trembling faintly. "Daddy spoke," he whispered, voice thick with wonder rather than fear. Ms. Rodriguez brushed his cheek with a fingertip, eyes glistening. "He did, sweetheart," she said softly, drawing him closer. "He's making sure you're safe." Liam nodded, burying his face against her shoulder, and for the first time allowed a shaky sigh of relief. Meanwhile, Sandra Whitmore hovered near the galley, her pristine uniform suddenly feeling constricting. She stared at the nearest monitor, her reflection ghost pale in the dark screen. Guests in her beloved first class looked on, some with sympathetic eyes, others with barely concealed disdain. The attendant's neatly arranged world of protocol and privilege had fractured in a single ping from a child's bracelet. In the cockpit, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We will be diverting to the nearest airport for an unscheduled stop and investigation. We apologize for the inconvenience and appreciate your cooperation." The words landed softly, but their weight stretched across every row, turning confusion into acceptance. A veteran flight attendant moved through the cabin, offering tissues and quiet assurances. She paused at each seat, her calm presence a salve against the earlier cruelty. "We'll get through this," she murmured, voice low but firm. Passengers returned her nods with grateful smiles. Even the most aloof business traveler tucked his laptop away, watched the attendant's kind eyes rather than his screen. Side conversations budded now, genuine hushed exchanges about the injustice they'd all witnessed. An elderly woman offered her compliment slip to Liam. "Here, dear, use this to draw me a picture. I have plenty of pencils." A father in the back row bent to speak into his daughter's ear. "See, honey? Sometimes you have to stand up when things aren't fair." The seed of compassion planted by Arjun's quiet intervention was blossoming in real time. Through it all, the cabin's atmosphere shifted from shock to solidarity. Strangers reached out, sharing blankets and smiles, murmuring words of support for the small boy. The initial tension gave way to a collective desire to right a wrong, a ripple that started with one brave voice and spread until every heart felt its echo. And at the center of it all, Liam's bracelet lay hidden beneath the blanket. Its glow faded, but its purpose fulfilled. The cabin had come alive with empathy and resolve long before landing gear was lowered. In that charged silence after the twist, Arjun Patel's promise had done more than ground a plane. It had united a diverse group of travelers in defense of the most vulnerable among them. As the Airbus cleaved through wispy clouds toward its emergency descent, a subtle warmth filled the cabin. It wasn't the glow of service lights or the hum of electronics, but the quiet assurance that justice, once awakened, moves swiftly and surely, even if it begins with a single, silent ping. The cabin lights flickered once more as the overhead monitors sprang back to life, this time showing a grainy but unmistakable video clip. Every screen across both first class and business class now replayed the moment Sandra Whitmore's hand came down on Liam's cheek. The tiny, clear image of his startled face and the swift motion of her arm looped again in a silent, unyielding loop. Sandra froze in the galley doorway, her eyes fixed on the screens. Her neatly pinned hair seemed to wilt under the glare of her own actions played in public view. The hush that followed the initial override message deepened into a collective intake of breath. At the sight of his son's pain, Arjun Patel's heart clenched, but his expression softened with a fierce tenderness. He recognized that look of shock on his own face. He'd often reminded himself that leadership sometimes meant listening when it was hardest to stay silent. Passengers gasped, leaning forward in their seats, some clutching handrails as though bracing for impact. A silver-haired businessman in 2A raised a trembling finger to press the play button again, refusing to look away. A woman in pearls stared at the screen until tears pooled in her lashes. There was no background music, no narrator, simply the raw reality of Sandra's cruelty laid bare for all to see. Sandra's breath hitched. She took a trembling step backward. Her heels clicked against the cabin floor, a staccato sound that felt deafening. I didn't know," she stammered, eyes flicking toward any escape. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean—" Her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her throat as though to staunch an invisible wound. In that moment, a steward approached her gently. "Ms. Whitmore, please follow me to the jump seat." There was no harshness in his tone, only quiet authority. Sandra's shoulders sagged as she nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. Each step she took down the aisle was measured, as though she feared the very ground beneath her. Arjun watched her, his stern gaze softening into something almost sorrowful. He understood that people make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes are devastating. He remembered his own missteps when SkyVista was still finding its wings, but he also knew that accountability was the only path forward. He lifted his hand in a small, almost imperceptible gesture, an unspoken promise that punishment here would be measured by justice, not vengeance. As Sandra reached the jump seat, a hush fell so deep that the gentle hum of the engine sounded like thunder in a canyon. The steward guided her to sit, snapping the harness into place with a clinical click. Sandra's shoulders shook as she lowered her head, allowing the weight of every eye in the cabin to settle on her. Behind her, screenshots of the video evidence cycled through the monitors. Close-ups of Liam's tear-filled face, the lines of shock etched on his tiny cheek, the moment his hand flew to his mouth. The screens displayed each frame like shards of broken trust. Some passengers turned their heads away in protest, but most watched in grim fascination. Liam sat tightly beside Ms. Rodriguez, clutching his new sketch pad but not daring to draw. His wide eyes followed Sandra's retreating figure, confusion and a flicker of pity mingling on his face. He leaned into Ms. Rodriguez. "She looks scared," he whispered. The simple observation cut through the cabin's tension. Despite everything, he still felt compassion for the frightened woman. Ms. Rodriguez placed an arm around his small shoulders, nodding. "Yes, honey. She's learning what it feels like when someone watches you do something wrong." Her voice was soft but firm, a reminder that empathy and justice could coexist. Liam nodded, pressing a thumb to his lips, and then looked out at the gentle expanse of clouds. In the silence that followed, a steward's quiet voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. This flight will be diverting and will disembark at the nearest airport." His words, spoken without emotion, felt like a final punctuation mark on the day's drama. Passengers began to stir, gathering belongings with a renewed sense of camaraderie. Conversations started in murmurs, offers to help Sandra find her bag, gentle admonitions about setting things right, and expressions of relief that the airline's leadership had intervened. Some even reached out to Sandra as she unbuckled her harness, an elderly woman placing a gentle hand on her arm, sharing a look that said, "We all make mistakes. Now let's fix it." Arjun leaned forward, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Liam, are you all right?" he asked, eyes full of genuine concern. Liam nodded and climbed into his father's lap, pressing his cheek against Arjun's chest. The torn sketch pad fell forgotten at their feet. Arjun kissed the top of his son's head. "You are so brave," he whispered. "I'm so proud of you." Liam wrapped his arms around his father's neck, closing his eyes in relief. From her jump seat, Sandra watched the embrace with tears streaming silently down her face. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her ID badge, trembling as she held it aloft. I deserve this," she said quietly to no one in particular. Somewhere in that admission lay the first seeds of redemption, an acceptance of responsibility that even the sternest policies could not demand. And as the plane began its slow descent toward the unexpected landing, a sense of collective hope filled the cabin. In that moment of reckoning, it wasn't just a child's innocence that was restored. It was a reminder that even small acts of cruelty can be checked by a single voice of authority, and that true leadership listens first to the cries of the harmed. Liam opened his eyes and looked around at the cabin now bathed in the soft glow of returning service lights. Strangers gave him approving nods. A child of 4 had reminded them of the simple power of compassion. And in that collective glance, he found the truest reward of all, knowing that right, no matter how quietly delivered, would always echo louder than any act of cruelty. The engine's drone dropped to a steady rumble as the Airbus turned toward its unscheduled landing. Over the intercom, the captain's calm voice broke the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are diverting to Miami International Airport for an immediate safety and conduct investigation. Thank you for your patience." A collective exhale rippled through the cabin, relief tinged with excitement. This was more than a detour. It was the moment the world would see justice unfold. Moments later, the wheels kissed the tarmac at Miami International. The landing gear's thump felt like a punctuation mark on the day's drama. A flight attendant unhooked Sandra from her jump seat and, with 2 colleagues, escorted her toward the rear cabin door. Passengers craned their necks, some leaning forward in their seats, others craning cameras to capture the moment. A hush fell again as Sandra disappeared down the aisle, her heels clicking a staccato retreat. The cabin door opened, letting in warm Florida air and the distant roar of ground traffic. A team of SkyVista ground staff, crisp in their navy blazers, boarded immediately. One handed a folded press release to the purser, who passed it with a nod to the lead flight attendant. The flight attendant then moved swiftly through the aisles, paper in hand. Passengers watched as she cleared her throat and addressed them. On behalf of SkyVista Airlines, we sincerely apologize for the distressing incident involving one of our youngest passengers. Effective immediately, Ms. Sandra Whitmore has been placed on administrative leave, pending a full and transparent investigation. We are committed to ensuring the safety, dignity, and respect of every traveler on our flights. Her voice was professional, devoid of emotion but firm in accountability. Arjun rose from his seat and followed the crew to the cabin door, Liam in tow. As they descended the aisle, a smattering of applause erupted. Soft at first, then swelling into genuine appreciation. Even the most aloof business travelers straightened their suits and offered nods of respect. A flight attendant handed Liam a fresh blank sketch pad and a small box of crayons as he passed. He gripped them tightly, hope flickering in his big blue eyes. Outside on the tarmac, a press gaggle had assembled. Cameras, microphones, and reporters in crisp suits, their expressions taut with anticipation. A SkyVista PR manager guided Arjun and Liam toward a branded podium set up just off the jetway. The family photographers clicked rapidly, capturing the moment the CEO reunited with his son, his crisp navy suit unbuttoned at the top, his tie loosened in solidarity with the boy's disheveled hair. Arjun crouched to Liam's level, brushing a crumb of cookie from his son's cheek. "You okay, champ?" he asked, voice soft but clear. Liam nodded, clutching his sketch pad. "Did Daddy make it stop?" he asked. Arjun placed a reassuring hand on Liam's back. "I did, and we're going to make things right," he promised, then rose to face the cameras. He cleared his throat and lifted a hand to quiet the crowd. "Good afternoon. I'm Arjun Patel, CEO of SkyVista Airlines. Today, our airline fell short of our highest standards of service and care. The incident involving my son was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility. We have onboarded a third-party investigator to conduct a swift and thorough review of our policies and personnel actions. Ms. Whitmore has been placed on leave pending that review, and we are redoubling our training programs to ensure this never happens again." His gaze swept the throng of faces, journalists, ground crew, fellow passengers, before settling on Liam, who peered back with an earnest expression. Arjun smiled, pride and relief mingling in his eyes. "And to my boy," he added, bending slightly, "thank you for being brave." Liam flashed a small grin, lifting his crayon box as though accepting a medal. Reporters shouted questions. "Will Sandra face legal consequences? How will SkyVista support wounded travelers? What steps will you take to restore public trust?" Arjun fielded each with composed candor, promising transparency, improved protocols, and child safety measures. He spoke in a tone that was both authoritative and genuinely apologetic, an embodiment of the quiet power his passengers knew him for. As the flashbulb stuttered, Ms. Rodriguez hovered nearby, quietly handing Liam a sealed envelope, a personalized apology note from Sandra, written, at the company's request, to the boy she'd harmed. Liam folded the note carefully, eyes bright with empathy. He tucked it into his sketch pad, then offered a shy wave to the cameras. Once the formalities wrapped, Arjun guided Liam toward the waiting SUV, his arm securely around his son's shoulders. Inside the vehicle, Liam looked back at the cabin, still engraved in his mind. "Can we go home now?" he asked softly. Arjun started the engine and glanced back. "Almost, buddy. But first, we make sure everyone learns from today." He ruffled Liam's hair. "Then we'll go home together." As the SUV rolled away, leaving the diverted flight behind, a sense of justice hung in the warm Miami air. The public reversal had been swift, silent, yet unstoppable, proving that sometimes the quietest decisions echo the loudest. and that true leadership is measured by how fiercely one protects the smallest among us. By the time the SUV pulled away from the jetway, news of the incident had exploded across every SkyVista channel. Internal memos arrived in employees' inboxes within minutes. Effective immediately, Ms. Sandra Whitmore is terminated for violation of our code of conduct. A full review of child safety protocols is underway. Outside the company, social media lit up with the cabin footage. Every loop of that slap replayed countless times, fueling outrage and sympathy in equal measure. In Miami's media center, reporters buzzed like restless bees, microphones poised as Arjun Patel stepped up to the podium once more. He apologized again, this time to the global audience. "We failed one of our youngest passengers," he said, voice taut but genuine. "That mistake will never be repeated." Behind him, a banner unfurled. SkyVista Child Safe Havens, because every passenger deserves respect. Back in the waiting area, Liam sat curled against his father's leg, clutching his sketch pad. When Arjun returned from the press briefing, he swept Liam into a hug so fierce it shook them both. Tears pooled in his eyes. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he whispered. Liam pressed his cheek against Arjun's chest. "It's okay, Daddy. They made it right." Ground staff handed out small brochures announcing a new family care suite pilot program, an age-segmented area with trained attendants, sensory-friendly lighting, and guaranteed adult-to-child ratios. News outlets praised the move, calling it a model for every major carrier. Meanwhile, HR agents escorted Sandra from the terminal in a discreet black SUV. A final email circulated internally. "We support all employees, but we stand firmly for accountability. We will offer Sandra counseling and transition assistance as we do for any team member in crisis." The tone struck a balance between justice and compassion. A difficult line SkyVista was determined to walk. On the ride back to his Palo Alto home, Arjun held Liam's little hand in his, glancing down at the green bracelet now quiet on the boy's wrist. He thought of the journey ahead, rebuilding trust with families, retraining crew, weaving empathy into every flight. But most of all, he thought of giving his son back the sky as a place of wonder, not fear. Liam looked up, eyes bright. "Daddy," he said, voice earnest, "can I draw you another picture?" Arjun smiled, pulling out a fresh sheet from his jacket pocket. "Only if you promise to keep it safe, for both of us." Liam giggled as he settled into his father's lap, crayons at the ready. In that embrace, the Patel duo found closure, a powerful reminder that true leadership means protecting the most vulnerable, and that no apology is ever enough without action to follow. A soft glow filled the first-class cabin as SkyVista Flight 904 taxied toward the runway. 4-year-old Liam Patel sat beside his father, his small hand tucked into Arjun's. It was their first flight together since Miami, a simple family trip to celebrate Daddy's new Family Care Suites rollout. Now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin felt more like a sanctuary than a stage. Liam settled into the same cream leather seat that had once been his battleground. He glanced up at his dad, whose palm rested lightly on the boy's shoulder. There was no staff drama today, no curt dismissals, only the low hum of anticipation and the gentle clink of crystal water glasses on polished tables. The passengers around them whispered softly to one another, but their eyes held warmth instead of indifference. Arjun leaned forward, brushing a loose strand of hair from Liam's forehead. "You ready for takeoff, buddy?" he asked, voice calm and affectionate. Liam nodded, a confident smile lighting his face. He pressed his cheek to the window, watching the runway lights slide past. "I think I like this seat," he said, patting the seat cushion. "Can we draw now?" "Absolutely," Arjun replied, handing him a fresh sketch pad. "Draw anything you want." Liam's eyes sparkled, and he clicked open a new box of crayons, reds, blues, greens, each color a promise of possibility. A gentle chime announced the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, We will be taking off shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts. The routine announcement passed like a familiar lullaby, and Liam's father reached to secure his own belt, then tugged Liam close for a quick pre-flight hug. Outside, the engines soared to life. The plane accelerated, and the world blurred beyond the window, city lights trailing like comets. Inside, there was no trace of the afternoon scandal, no shadow of that storm. Instead, every smile, every silent nod, felt like the residue of something far stronger than anger, a shared belief in quiet justice. As they lifted into the night sky, Liam began to sketch a new airplane, its wings spreading wide. He drew clouds beneath it and stenciled the words SkyVista, where everyone belongs, in bold letters. Arjun watched, pride swelling in his chest. The boy's hand moved confidently, unafraid. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft blue, and a hush fell over the passengers. An appreciative silence that carried no judgment, only the thrill of soaring free. Arjun placed his head gently against Liam's, and the two watched the world fall away. In that serene moment, father and son understood a simple truth. Power didn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispered through a single act of compassion, echoing in every heart it touched. And though the skies would always hold their share of turbulence, the silent promise they shared would guide them home, wherever they flew next.